Under Secretary General at the United Nations, who will talk to us about the two books, his most recent books, Inglorious Empire and Why I Am a Hindu. Engaging him in conversation is Tunku Vardharajan, who is a former editor of Newsweek Global, Newsweek International, and the Wall Street Journal, and is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a contributing editor of Politico Europe. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shashi Tharoor and Tunku Vardharajan.
If I offered you a choice of two things and nothing else, which would you choose? Living in an India governed by the RSS or living in an India governed by the British?
And you're saying I don't have a choice to say neither, right?
You need to justify the neither.
No, I mean, the thing is that the answer genuinely is neither, except that to some degree we already are living in an India governed by the RSS. So, I voted with my feet, I'm there, and I'm doing my best to change that particular reality. But the fact is that in our country, the answer to your question is I'd much rather be ruled by my own people whom I happen to disagree with, than by foreigners coming and telling me what to do in my country.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
And tell me about the people you disagree with. Why do you disagree with them so vehemently? And why did it take you, me, many like us, the election of a BJP government in India for us to remember that we were Hindus? Those of us that are.
Those are two different questions. I'm quite happy to address them in reverse order, if you like, because certainly those here, there may be some who've actually read me for a period of years, will know there's nothing terribly new about my avowal of my Hinduism or references to it. The great Indian novel is 29 years old, and in it there's this sort of a running obsession with dharma. In my novel Riot, which talks about the Ramshila Pujan agitation leading up to the whole Ram Janmabhoomi business, there is an early evocation of the rise of Hindutva and the arguments being advanced for and against. And in my book India from Midnight to the Millennium, which is now 20 years ago, written for the 50th anniversary of India's independence, I've even got 2 or 3 pages prefiguring what I've now written an entire book about, which is precisely my personal experience of being brought up in a Hindu household and my own beliefs. So in that sense, I didn't wait for the BJP to come to power to talk about Hinduism. It's always mattered to me, and I've actually, many in this room I can see were in some of my audiences for speeches I've made about Hinduism, going back now 25 years soon after Babri Masjid demolition, when I was called upon very often to address this subject in public and shared some of my anguish and some of my reflections on the broader question. So, short answer, it's nothing to do really specifically with the BJP. These have been my views consistently for a very long time. But why I felt the moral urgency to put them between the covers of a book and lay them out there for the nation is precisely what has been happening in the last few years, where people of a particular political persuasion have not only been articulating a view of Hinduism that is extremely difficult to recognize, but that the vast majority of Hindus who have grown up conscious of their Hinduism would disavow. The faith in which we were brought up is not one which legitimizes assaulting human beings in the name of cow protection. It is not one in which you would lynch somebody on suspicion that the bag of meat he's carrying is beef. It is not a religion in which you would flog Dalit boys because they happen to be skinning the carcass of a dead cow. It is not a religion that reduces the soaring majesty of the metaphysics of the Vedas and the Upanishads and so on into something much more like the team identity of the British football hooligan, which is what they've gone and tried to do to it. And I thought it was high time that people like myself tried to take Hinduism back for those of us who don't see this as an accurate representation of our faith. And so that's why I wrote the book now. Now your first question, of course, in that double-barrel thing was about why I don't like what the RSS stands for. And that's something which I'll make very clear. I mean, this is a movement whose ideological moorings are actually very clearly laid out in the writings of its founders. It's not that one has to project biases or prejudices onto them before deciding whether to like or dislike them. They have laid out their beliefs in black and white, very often in English. So there isn't even the accusation of a bad translation to blame. If you look at what the RSS stands for, it is foursquare a product of the same sorts of ideas that were going around the world in the 1920s, the same time the RSS was founded. And the language used about Hindutva is essentially the same as the language used by Italian fascism, by Francoism in Spain, and by Nazism in Germany. In fact, it's striking because Hinduism is a religion, not a race. But the man who came up with the concept of Hindutva, V.D. Savarkar, repeatedly speaks of Hindus as a race. He talks about racial pride in exactly the same way that the European fascists are talking about racial pride. It is a phenomenon of a particular time in human history in the 20th century, discredited and defeated within 20 years everywhere else. Well, not 20 for Spain, it lasted longer. But at the end, not really a serious threat to human beings anymore anywhere in the world, until suddenly the people who still hew to these beliefs have managed to find themselves in power in the world's largest democracy. And so what worries me very much is how much of their beliefs they still hold on to. And when they're given a chance to actually execute those beliefs, what horrors await us. I mean, the RSS's principal, Sarsan Chalak, the head of the organization for 33 years, from 1940 to 1973, M.S. Golwalkar, has actually written in black and white that what should be done to the Muslims of India is what Hitler did to the Jews, that it offers a very fine example to be followed in India. We have a series of RSS leaders and thinkers who are profoundly unconvinced by the principles embodied in the Indian Constitution. Today we have a president, a vice president, a prime minister, who are all sworn servants of the RSS, who have all grown up in that organization. They don't have the ability to tear up the Constitution, but they repeatedly cite as their ideological mentor a man called Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who was head of the Jan Sangh and who was the author of a book called Integral Humanism, which has a lot of very unobjectionable things in it as well, but who essentially said the Constitution of India should be discarded, that it's wrong. And he said so on two grounds. The first, I think we can all accept, which is that it's a constitution that's full of imported Western ideals, written by Anglophone lawyers in the wrong language, and that's true, there's not much you can do about it. But the more serious and more profound objection that Deen Dayal Upadhyaya had, echoing exactly the same objections of V.D. Savarkar and M.S. Golwalkar, was that he said the Constitution is wrong because it rests on a completely flawed premise. What is the flawed premise? It doesn't understand what a nation is. What does he mean? He said, well, the Constitution assumes that the nation called India is a territory called India and all the people living on it. Wrong, he says, a nation is not a territory. A nation is a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people. And therefore everybody else is either a guest or an interloper and must be dealt with accordingly. So the Constitution of India can only be a constitution for a Hindu Rashtra because that is the idea of nation. And in fact, all three have extensively decried the notion of what they call territorial nationalism. So in my book, Why I'm a Hindu, apart from spending 130 pages talking about the faith in which I grew up, the faith I read, studied, practiced, and learned from the great teachers and preceptors of Hinduism, I have an entire section in which I summarize the views of the Hindutva ideologues in their own words. No one can accuse me of unfairly paraphrasing them. I've been very fair to what they themselves have written, in some detail. And yes, if some of you find it bone-chilling to read what they believe, this is what they believe. Now, you can turn around and say, well, you know, those were the days when people could write these things because they never had any expectation of ever coming to power. Now that they're in power, they moderate their views. And that's possible. That is entirely possible because certainly there has been no step in the last 4.5 years of the BJP government to either undo the constitution or, change the nature of the Indian polity fundamentally. But don't forget right now, they haven't had the 3 desiderata required to achieve that end. To amend the Indian constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in the lower house, a 2/3 majority in the upper house, and half the Indian states. Now they had, with their coalition allies, the 2/3 in the lower house, they have 20 of the 29 states, plus coalition governments and 2 more. What they don't have so far is the majority in the upper house, the Rajya Sabha. But given their dominance of the state legislatures, they will eventually acquire that too. So literally the only thing stopping them is the prospect of not acquiring a thumping majority in the next Lok Sabha elections, the lower house elections.
But do you think, that you can respond to that, do you think that the government that we have in India at present is fascist or proto-fascist? Just a yes or no?
These journalists in the yes or no. No, not yet. But let me first of all, on your first point, say that I'm not saying that it was just a rhetorical piety. Maybe Mr. Modi meant it. But it's actually inconceivable to hold in your mind these 2 opposing thoughts at the same time. On the one hand, the Constitution is my only holy book. On the other hand, I worship Deen Dayal Upadhyaya and I want you to study every word he ever wrote. Because it's one or the other. You cannot, conceivably say I'm all in favor of racial equality and I admire Hitler. But it's just the two thoughts don't go together. So one or the other has to be reconciled. Or, as I said, Mr. Modi should turn around and say, I think Upadhyaya said a lot of wise things, but on this thing I disagree, and then we can move on. But that disavowal has never happened.
We'll try this. Oh,
Oh, it's working now.
to celebrate the
We
arrival.
can interrupt each other now.
I wouldn't agree with it, but let me try anyway. If the BJP government were to get these super majorities that you fear, what other sorts of things that you think they would undo in the Constitution? What in the Constitution stands threatened?
Well, it seems that they would apparently declare India to be a Hindu state, an Hindu Rashtra, the only one on the planet. There was one earlier in Nepal, but they've scrapped that and then become a secular state. Presumably they would then define certain rights and lack thereof for the minorities. Which is worrying because triumphant majoritarianism is alarming in any situation, but it's particularly alarming in a context in which your largest minority is a mere matter of 180 million people. You could be creating a recipe for a nightmare, to put it very bluntly. You also, of course, would have to do violence to the provisions of the Constitution that guarantee freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom to convert and choose your own religion, freedom to propagate your own religion, all of which are enshrined in the Constitution, none of which would be compatible with such an idea. You would presumably have to go beyond that in certain specific things. For example, we have in our country today laws that not just enshrine certain protections of minorities, but give them certain rights that others don't have. For example, minority education institutions and the privileges associated there too. Those might disappear. We'll have to wait and see. The drafting is taking place behind closed doors. But these are serious issues. I'm not sitting here being alarmist for the sake of being alarmist. I mean, I think that the Indian electorate is profoundly sensible and is not necessarily going to allow this to happen. But I just feel that we should be conscious of the dangers. And particularly Hindu Indians ought to be conscious that a lot of this is sought to be done in our name. And you know, it's time we stood up and said, not in my name, buddy. This is not who I am, this is not what I believe.
Right. Hindus against Hindutva.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the years preceding this latest BJP government, the manner in which India's largely Congress-dominated secular elites treated religion, particularly Hinduism, like sort of keeping it at arm's length, somehow left the field wide open for the use of Hinduism as a political weapon by its opponents?
Absolutely.
And was that, I mean, was it a mistake? And could Nehru and his successors have done things differently?
No, I don't know if it was a mistake. I mean, Nehru was personally agnostic. He was not, in fact, his letters in which he's talked about his impatience with mullahs and maulvis as well as sadhus and sants of various sorts. He didn't feel they had any space in public discourse. He wanted a country in which we were free of this kind of religious idea in public life. And like many agnostics and atheistic people, he kind of assumed that the relevance of religion would disappear. He made a famous speech describing dams and factories as the new temples of modern India. And I think even at that time, people thought the old temples would be likely to survive the dams and the factories. But the fact is that secularism, in the Nehru style, was closer to the Western understanding of secularism, which is an absence of religion, distancing from religion, as you said. Though in practice, Indian secularism largely became about there being a profusion of religions, all of which were privileged by the state, and I mean none of which were privileged by the state, all of which were allowed to flourish. Now that kind of secularism had its advantages and its disadvantages. If you look at French laïcité today, for example, you cannot walk into a French government institution or even a French school wearing a cross or a crucifix or a turban or a hijab or a burqa or any of those overt signs of your religious affiliation. In India, on the contrary, all of these things can be found in every government office or in any government school, and then people simply accept that. So it's not secularism in the Western sense. But having said that, at least the state never professed a religion, and constitutionally and legally, people of any religion were equal to people of any other religion in terms of their rights, their liberties, and so on and so forth. Now what's happened in recent years is, as a result, and that may be where the mistake you allude to comes in, it suited the Hindutva brigade to be able to portray the issue as one between true Hindus and godless secularists. And you know, if you're out there, then any true Hindu really has no other place to turn but to them, because apparently everybody else is a godless secularist. So I decided to reframe the debate and say, wait a minute, there's actually an argument within Hinduism between two different sets of Hindus. One of whom says, sorry, our Hinduism is actually inclusive and accommodative and coexists with others and is actually true to the faith as it's been taught and preached to all of us. Your Hinduism is a political ideology, it's nothing to do with our religion, and in fact distorts and betrays it. So we can actually have an argument within the Hindu faith rather than letting it be between sort of believers versus unbelievers, which I think queers the pitch for some of us.
Tell me, let's move to sort of gentler themes.
Winston Churchill.
No, we'll come to that later. When you grew up, you were raised in Hindu. I assume your parents. Tell us about the Hinduism you imbibed at home. What was it like, and how is it different from the raucous Hinduism that surrounds us in India right now?
Well, you know, I've spent 132 pages describing it, so I'm not going to be able to do justice to it in a short answer. But there is, of course, the Hinduism of practice, of ritual, of watching my father every single day in the prayer room standing outside after his shower, after his bath, with his wet towel around him and his hair still uncombed.
The wet towel is very important.
Yeah, chanting his mantras. And equally the fact that he never obliged me to join him. He exemplified the Hindu idea that religion is an intensely personal matter, that it's essentially about you and your relationship to your maker, or to your idea of the divine, and that he wanted me to find my own truth, which I think I have, and it certainly is partly inspired by his devotion, partly inspired by the way in which he practices devotion. For example, he was somebody who dragged us off on pilgrimages to various temples. When there was a fire in Kerala's Guruvayur temple, he actually sort of consecrated his meager savings at the time to a fundraising campaign to rebuild the temple and helped lead a committee that collected funds for that purpose. A very devout Hindu, and yet when a friend of his life insurance agent, as it happens, was an Anglo-Indian gentleman whose name I still remember, John P. Condor, returned from the Vatican with an amulet of the Virgin Mary that he said had been blessed by the Pope. My father carried it around with him for the rest of his life. The Hindu idea is that something that's been sanctified by the worship of others is worthy of worship. And it's very interesting because that goes to the heart of Hindu belief. Swami Vivekananda, in that wonderful speech in Chicago in 1893, talked about how he had learned the childhood verse, the Shiva Mahimna Stotra, which talks about how as different rivers can flow straight and crooked in different directions to the same sea, so also all ways of worship end up with the same God and the same idea of the divine, and therefore it doesn't matter. This is really very, very interesting, because when Hinduism started way back in the Vedic years, it had a notion of the Godhead that was rather like the Islamic notion. The Nirguna Brahman, that is a God without qualities, without form, without shape, without gender. God as an idea, an abstraction, a force, a breath, a spark. But after about 1,000 years of that, they realized that Hindus actually wanted something to worship. They were going off and worshipping fire, they were worshipping rivers, they were worshipping mountains. And so the sages of the day moved from the concept of Nirguna Brahman to the Saguna Brahman, a God with qualities, but they also had the philosophical noose, as it were, to say, wait a minute, nobody knows what the divine looks like. Nobody knows what, God is. You can't see, imagine, touch, whatever. So let us free people, since we're talking really about the limitations of the human imagination, let's free people to imagine God as they want. So that's why we have 333 million names of God and forms and manifestations of God. So if you want to imagine God as a pot-bellied figure with an elephant head, that's fine. If you want to imagine God as an 8-armed woman riding a tiger, that's fine too. And by the same logic, if you want to imagine God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that is acceptable to Hinduism. There is absolutely no difference. The Hindus cheerfully will go to other people's places of worship as long as they don't feel excluded from them. Because this is fine. All these are different ways of reaching out to the same divinity.
I've often wondered why Christ wasn't incorporated as an avatar.
I think because the Christians had more. In fact, I suspect anything, because what the Hindus did, of course, was that Buddhism and Jainism were quite cheerfully brought into the canon, and Buddha became, I think, the 7th or the 8th avatar of Vishnu. And that's typically the way in which Hinduism reacted to all these things. We borrowed marvelously. I mean, many people don't realize this. Hindus had no temples until the Greeks showed up in the 4th century BC. Islam was not inclined to be absorbed, shall we put it that way. And so it was more a reaction to Islam that witnessed certain practices. I would say that the greater democratization and popularization of the faith was happening partly in parallel before, when, for example, Ramanuja in the south was already getting the Sanskrit mantras rendered in the local vernacular languages. He was encouraging people to pray in their own ways, even before Islam had reached southern India. But there is very little doubt that the Bhakti movement, which in many ways, for a few centuries, incorporated and enshrined the revivalism of Hinduism in the face of Islamic rule, was in very many ways a reaction to Islam. I'm not sure I could honestly say that we borrowed any principle from Islam. Sikhism did take on, for example, the idea of brotherhood, the idea of equality, fraternity from Islamic practice. Hinduism, not quite in the same way.
I mean, Islam would appear to have tested the absorptive limits of the Hindu religion.
Yes, and so did Christianity to some degree. Christianity, early on, I mean, Christianity again has a very complicated history in India, because in the south, particularly in Kerala, it came in the lifetime of one of the apostles at the very least, St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas, is said to have showed up on the shores of Kerala around 52 AD, where he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl, because we had the world's oldest Jewish diaspora outside Palestine. And he converted people then. So there are families in Kerala that have been Christian far longer than many Hindus have been conscious of themselves as Hindu. Having said that, that was obviously a very small community in the larger context. And the knowledge of Christianity in the rest of India came in two different forms. In parts of India through the Portuguese, which was by the sword during the Inquisition, accompanied by all the business of torture and forcible conversion and all the unpleasantness associated with that. And then the third wave, if you like, was the British, who had the additional challenge to Hinduism that they practiced a faith that was associated both with their own manifest superiority as the ruling power and with notions of modernity. And so many Hindus began to feel, oh my gosh, is our religion somehow inferior, because these Brits who are after ruling us are sneering at it. And that did create reform. So you had a number of Hindu sects reacting to these sort of British forms of Christianity. The most famous, of course, being Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the Brahmo Samaj, which has imbued a lot of Christian ethics into Hindu practice. But even someone like Dayananda Saraswati and the Arya Samaj, which is considered very much a revivalist in Hindu pride sort of movement, did a number of things which wouldn't have even occurred to Hindu sages had it not been for Christianity. One is the abolition of idol worship. Dayananda Saraswati and the Arya Samaj said, no, we will, if the British think, and they've persuaded us that idol worship is an inferior form of worship, no idols. We will have also a respect for just one set of holy books rather than the thousands of holy books we have. So just the Vedas and nothing else. Not even the Upanishads are considered holy by the Arya Samajis. So you have no idols, you have the holy book, and you have a conversion ceremony, a Shuddhika, because the British had baptism, right? So how do we manage to get Hindus to have sort of feel themselves sanctified and certified as Hindus? You create a conversion ceremony. So all of these things were reactions to sort of late colonial Christianity. But otherwise, Hinduism would have absorbed any faith that was willing to be absorbed.
But all of these things led, one might say, organically to the RSS and modern Hindutva. No. This austerity.
I argue that Hindutva has nothing to do with Hinduism. It is a purely political ideology.
No, but this rendering Hinduism into a sort of quasi-Abrahamic thing that many of the reformers sought to do ultimately paved the way for a particular form of thought, maybe.
It may have ended up there. I'll come back to that in a second, but I would more argue that Hindutva is a product of a profound inferiority.
I'm just trying to get you to blame Hindutva on the British.
Give me a little more time and I might even end up there. But no, the thing about it's actually born out of a profound inferiority complex. The Hindutva thinkers were people who were smarting from a sense of subjugation, of humiliation, of having been conquered, first by the Muslims, then by the British, all of this stuff. And that's why it fits in within the 1920s nationalist, race pride, self-assertion kind of thing. Savarkar wasn't even particularly religious. He actually said that he didn't go to temples much and didn't much believe in temples. He was essentially articulating a political ideology of the 1920s with all the intemperate language associated with that. In fact, I found there was an extraordinary European Nazi who moved to India in the 1930s and called herself Savitri Devi and wrote some really chilling sort of Hindutva screeds. And Savarkar wrote an introduction to one of her books, which is equally sort of chilling. But for these people, it's really completely classically of a piece with what Europe was seeing in the 30s, 20s and 30s. It really isn't any different. It's simply that for them, it was Hindu race pride, or mistakenly called race pride, that they wished to assert, whereas in other countries it was other forms of nationalist race pride. And that ideology never caught the imagination of the Indians. It's very interesting to realize that at a time when the Muslim League was rising and dividing the nationalist movement, the Hindu Mahasabha, which incorporated some of these ideas, never got more than 2% or 3% of the vote. And this largely has remained true. It's only in the last generation, the last 25 years, that you've seen a serious rise of the RSS and Hindu.
And to what do you ascribe that?
Difficult to put your finger on any one thing. One factor is certainly the development of identity politics, where unfortunately initially caste became an instrument for political mobilization in our democracy. You're competing for scarce resources. How do you divide the pie that you want in your society? What you try and do inevitably with the division of the pie is to carve out the labels for those who are entitled to bits and pieces of the pie, and identity becomes a convenient label. Initially it was caste, and indeed that got a further acceleration when you had the OBCs, the other backward classes, they're called, getting reservations as well. And I think it was inevitable that a party like the BJP, if not they themselves, and it was they themselves, would say, wait a minute, Hindus are 80%, if we can create an all-encompassing Hindu identity, even if we get half of them, we'll win every election. Now, they didn't get half of them. At no point did the BJP, until the last election, rise above 20% of the vote. But they were able to climb up from single digits to that 20% over a period of time, essentially on identity appeal. So there are some politicians appealing on the basis of caste, others appealing on the basis of another caste or their religion, whatever. And here is BJP saying, Hinduism is the identity, it's a national identity, we all belong, and we shall assert ourselves. I think that ultimately is what, so certainly our own democracy has contributed to the rise of Hindutva. I don't deny that.
Do you see a correlation between economic growth and increasing prosperity in India and the increase in intolerance? I mean, we were so much more secular when we were poorer.
No, I think that would be too facile a thing to draw. I think, in India, economic growth, and for that matter, if you look at China, for example, they've had extraordinary economic growth, and a one-party communist states that these more educated Chinese are not at all bothered about trying to overthrow. In fact, if anything, they're becoming more dictatorial now, with essentially a president for life having been elected and so on. So I wouldn't say that economic growth has any particular correlation to one kind of politics or political system.
Chinese political conditions are very different.
No, I agree with them. So, I mean, you've had economic growth in the West, and you've had democracy. You've had economic growth in India, and we have had a series of coalition governments during the peak years of economic growth. If you look at 1991 to 2014, that's a period of pretty significant growth, at least until 2009 or 10. Extraordinary growth. I think the average between 91 and 2011, 2 decades, would have been well over 8%. I think 8.8% was the average for those 2 decades. And you had coalition governments and democracy, and some would argue, or the BJP might argue, too much democracy. So I wouldn't think that you can draw that correlation now.
So the Hindu rate of growth wasn't an especially secular period, it wasn't.
Yeah, well, actually, the one use of the word Hindu to which the Hindutva movement objects is in that expression, the Hindu rate of growth, which was coined by an economist called Ralph Krishna at Delhi University in the 60s, to describe the sort of rate of growth of chugging along at 2 to 3%, when the Asian tigers were all growing at 7 and 8 and 9 and 10.
But it would have appealed to the Hindutva sense.
That's not the Hindu rate of growth, that's the Congress rate of growth. They wanted to say...
No, but the Hindutva brigade does have the sense of India being this nation that's slumbering and stagnating. hence the Hindu rate of growth sought to indicate that same level of underperformance.
Yes, they argue underperformance, but unfortunately they don't have a better performance to show for their time in power. That's the problem. I think, one of the ironies of all of this is that Mr. Modi had actually been able to fulfill the economic promises he made, which is what I think tipped his party over that sort of natural ceiling of 20-odd% into the 31% that won him an absolute majority in Parliament. If he'd been able to deliver economic development, then people would have been willing to overlook the Hindutva excesses. It's precisely the failure to deliver any of those promises, economic growth, job creation, the various things that the various dreams that were sold to the nation.
So you're saying he's not governing in the way that he campaigned?
There are people from Thomas Delino to Rajiv Malhotra talking about what it means to be an Indian and different identifying factors. So could you just talk about the role of the language of Sanskrit as being the thing that unifies us and what that means?
Well, Sanskrit,
Did everyone hear what she said?
the role of Sanskrit in what it means to be an Indian. Sanskrit is sort of the mother lode, right? It's the language from which most Indian languages are derived. The southern Dravidic languages are not derived from Sanskrit but have strong infusions of Sanskrit vocabulary. My own mother tongue, Malayalam, there's plenty of Sanskrit words, in fact probably more Sanskrit words than any other Indian language, even though it is technically a Dravidian language. So Sanskrit infuses a lot of India's languages. But it is not a popular language. It never was. Even in the ancient days, it was a language of a very narrow elite. It was a language spoken and written by the Brahmins. Knowledge was the preserve of a small elite. The ordinary people spoke vernaculars, Prakrits, and not Sanskrit. So it's a bit late today to sort of do to Sanskrit, say what the Israelis did to Hebrew. It can't happen. You can't suddenly make it a national language for everyone. It's literally impossible. It's also very complicated, sophisticated language with multiple declensions and cases and nominative forms and so on, which most ordinary folks will not easily master. But it's wonderful. I think so much of our classics are there. I hope that there will be a good cottage industry of Sanskrit scholars who are able to translate the riches, the mother lode into languages that others can have access to. And I've said openly in my book that I've read all my Hindu religious texts in English translations, and there are very good English translations available from the Vedas onwards and the Upanishads. You can actually find a lot of material in English, and I'm sure that's true in many Indian languages also. So you don't have to actually master Sanskrit to be able to feel more Indian. I mean, you can be conscious that it's there in the sort of mists of your cultural consciousness, but it doesn't have to be part of your lived reality today. And in any case, I think the last estimate I saw is 100,000 Sanskrit speakers in a country of 1.2 billion people.
Plus 700,000 Ayurvedic physicians.
Oh yeah, so Ayurveda, all of these things are there, but again, you can practice Ayurveda without actually knowing Sanskrit. Your original text, they come to Sanskrit, I actually have a big Ayurveda college in my constituency. I'm frequently the convocation speaker there. So I know they study Ayurveda texts in English and Malayalam. Very few of them actually read them in Sanskrit. The terms, of course, are Sanskritic terms, but the science goes back over 2,000 years. But again, the language, it's not in a meaningful sense a living language today, and therefore I would disagree that it's indispensable to feel Indian. You can feel Indian in Bengali, you can feel Indian in Telugu.
Actually, when I knew that you were coming today, I wasn't going to ask this question, which brought me to your mind this morning, but since it started so political, the spokesperson of the UN this morning, in his headlines, sent out this news, and I want your thoughts. India. This was India Today. India is considered to be the most dangerous country in the world for women, according to a poll by Thomson Reuters Foundation, which ranks India as the most dangerous for women more than war-torn Afghanistan and Syria, which came in second and third place, respectively. Times of India. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think we should ask an Indian woman to answer that. India, there have been an awful lot of unpleasant incidents involving women in recent years, and it's something which shames every Indian, no question about that, and particularly every Indian male. But a sweeping statement like the most dangerous country in the world for women is a bit difficult to swallow. I think there's no question there are problems, and I've been, I hope, one of those voices in the forefront arguing for greater gender sensitivity education from a very early days, for better police patrolling, for more women in the police forces, all sorts of attempts that can be made to make India a safer place for women. But India is still a place where women are relatively, I say relatively, free. They don't have the kinds of restrictions that, say, Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia imposes on women in terms of freedom of movement or of profession or of very many other kinds of restrictions, going out without a male relative, all of those things. They certainly don't face the kind of violence that, say, Syria does. So I'm quite astonished that India would rank above Afghanistan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and many other places as the world's most unsafe place. But I think quibbling over a headline-grabbing term like that is not the right thing to do. I think the important thing to do is that whether we disagree with that specific conclusion or not, we must acknowledge there is a problem, that women are feeling in many ways unsafe, that the number of incidents of violence and assaults against women are unacceptable, and that things must be done by the government and by Indian society to overcome that. So there I fully agree. I'm just not so sure about the headline. Who said that the entire learning of Asia and Arabia is not worth the contents of a single shelf of English books. He is a man who, and he was sneering at something of which he had no knowledge because he hadn't read any of the knowledge of Asia.
But we inherited the education system, his education system.
He, indeed, in his minute on education, decided to advocate English, but not for the masses. The British, including Macaulay, had no intention of educating the Indian public at large. Macaulay said we must create a small sliver, a class of Indians, Indian in blood and colour, English in taste, in morals, in opinions and in intellect. And that was, the purpose of that was to create a small group of people who would serve as collaborators of the British, to serve as interpreters between those who are governing us and the masses whom they rule. He explicitly ruled out extending the benefits of education to the Indian public as a whole. He said, maybe these Indians, once they learn English, they can translate the great knowledge of the West into Indian languages for the Indians. But the British were in India for the money. They weren't going to spend money on improving India and Indians. As late as 1930, 100 years after Macaulay almost made that speech, we have Will Durant, the American historian, observing to his shock that the entire education budget of the British government, from the kindergarten levels to the highest university level, for the whole of India, a country then of 330 million people, amounted to less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. The British were not interested in educating anybody in India. Indians started setting up, they said, it's obviously to our advantage now to learn this English language in order to be able to treat with those who are ruling us. And so Indians started setting up, Ram Mohan Roy set up colleges and universities in Calcutta. Some Western missionaries came, not British government money, to set up some colleges and universities. The British were not interested, I'm sorry to say, in educating any more than a handful of Indians to serve their purposes, and they sneered at them too. While having educated them, they sneered at them and treated them with racist condescension, which I have in some cases detailed in my book. So no, and Macaulay on top of that is the author of the awful Indian Penal Code. Most of those ills we are still saddled with more than a century. In fact, it was such an appalling document, written behind the high walls of a house without consulting a single Indian jurist or advocate or anybody about any reality of Indian lawmaking. that the British enacted for an entire generation. They weren't sure it would make any sense to do it.
Which actually, 70 years after the British left, we're still
We're still stuck with it, right?
Why haven't we got...
Indian inertia.